Stan, we're live.
Thank you, Larry Liberty Guy. That was the terrific and iconic Take Me Out to the Ball Game by former Fenway Park organist John Kiley. Used to love just listening to all the pregame music and the introduction music by John Kiley when I was a kid going to Fenway. I can't remember what year it was he left that post, but I hear that sound. It brings back such memories. So, so in the dugout, we wear the baseball caps. I'll go with the trusty Harvard cap today, not because there's any significance to the Harvard thing, just it's a good looking cap and it fits me nice. So believe it or not, for a former baseball player, I don't have a lot of caps. I really don't. I should get a collection, and so I can keep you on your toes a little bit more as to what I might be wearing on any given day. Okay, very excited about today's show. 3 components. The shortest component will be first some bloviation from me on the Derek Chauvin verdict in Minnesota on the death of George Floyd. I'll have some commentary on that, including the big question that nobody really seems to be addressing, that I thought was the whole point of this thing. But yet it's somehow gotten lost in everything. But lost in the media, but I know it's not lost with long-term implications. I'll explain in just a moment. In about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll have Charles Callanan. He was a former candidate for state senate here in Rhode Island. He's from East Greenwich. And he is, you all know the Act on Climate bill that was sadly passed in Rhode Island about, a few weeks ago and signed into law by Governor McKee. Terrible bill for Rhode Island's long-term future and competitiveness. But anyway, he has calculated what the costs might be for the average Rhode Island family in order to convert your homes into the Green New Deal standards that will likely, again, we can't say for sure what will happen, but that will likely be imposed on all homeowners in future years. So stay tuned for that from Charles Callanan in a few minutes. Then in the bottom of the hour, we're going to bring on a nationally acclaimed journalist from the National Review, Stanley Kurtz. What an interesting topic this is. I don't have an opinion on it yet. I'm going to be hearing from Mr. Kurtz and from others. And in fact, we're going to have one of the bill sponsors on tomorrow to defend or to rebut what Stanley Kurtz says today. But there's a civics bill that requires civics education that passed the House last week. But according to Stanley Kurtz, this is part of a national leftist, conspiracy, whatever you want to call it, that's basically critical race theory in disguise. And that maybe the Republican sponsors of these bills have been unwittingly duped. Wow, I don't know, because it requires this action civics component. So we're going to learn about action civics from Mr. Kurtz at the bottom of the hour. And then tomorrow on our show, as I mentioned, we'll have Representative Brian Newberry on, one of the sponsors of this bill that Stanley Kurtz will talk about with us, and he'll give his rebuttal, his side of the story, which I'm eager to hear as well. And then at the bottom of the hour tomorrow, our regular Thursday half-hour session with Dr. Andrew Bostom on all things COVID. He's discovered that there's been a 50-year-old Rhode Island woman died the same day she got a vaccine, and nobody's talking about it. Nobody's talking about it. They just stick their head in the sands. He's wondering if this requires a medical examiner's investigation or why the news media isn't talking about it. I don't know. We'll find out more. He's going to look around at some more data stuff, and we'll talk about that plus other COVID things. All right. First, some comments from me before we get to our first guest on the Derek Chauvin verdict. Look. We've had Judge Flanders on this show a lot, and we've talked about, how can various appeals courts and, and other courts seem to be so influenced by public opinion where they won't even hear a case. A lot of this emanated from the supposed or the questionable results of the 2020 election, when courts just routinely at any level just wouldn't even hear the cases, wouldn't even hear it because of public pressure, media pressure, whatever, cocktail parties they might not be invited to. And Judge Flanders said, listen, judges are human too. They're not a machine, they're human. They can be influenced by stuff. Well, so can jurors, right? So can jurors. And the question here is, was this ruling yesterday in Minnesota real, pure American justice, or was it mob justice? Let me explain. I don't know the answer, but there are some legitimate questions to be raised here. No question, there were extenuating circumstances with George Floyd. He apparently took drugs. He resisted arrest. They were trying to subdue him. The drugs may or may not have contributed to his death. I wasn't at the trial. I don't know. But also clearly, Derek Chauvin had his knee ground into his back and neck. And when you're a human juror, no amount of unseen testimonial evidence about drugs or resisting arrest or prior criminal record is going to overcome the image of a police officer with a knee on the back of someone's neck for 9 minutes. These are humans, these jurors. There was no other verdict they were going to reach, probably. That's my general view. But there were also other extenuating circumstances to their verdict. The relentless media. Apparently they weren't sequestered. I even got bad news reports on the last 2 days. Apparently the jury wasn't sequestered. So whatever news reports you and I saw, they saw. I mean, there was relentless media about this case. Some of you probably know some left-wing group there, I don't know who, posted the profiles of every juror. They didn't put their names, but they put, apparently, as it was termed, they put enough information about them, where they lived, their age, their skin color, their whatever else about them. So it wouldn't be too hard to figure out who they were, with the implicit threat: if you don't vote, vote to convict, mob's going to come after you. Now, that's not the way our justice system is supposed to work. That was publicly put out there, the profiles of every juror. Yeah, the Maxine Waters comment basically saying the same thing. You don't vote to convict on all counts. I'm encouraging violence in the streets, confrontations, she said. One of the witnesses had a bloody pig's head thrown against his door, except it wasn't his door, where he used to live. They screwed up, but still, the threat, hey, they actually, it's not just an idle threat. We will come after you if you don't act the way we want. Jurors saw that news account, or they might have seen it. Of course, the tacit threat of mob violence. So all these extenuating factors that just shouldn't be when we're talking about real justice. So was this real justice? Listen, I think, like I said, that video of Derek Chauvin, I don't know how you overcome that regardless of whether these other external influences. Now, those are human jurors. They saw a guy alive. They saw a knee go on the neck, and then they saw a guy die. It was all on video. That's, no matter what the extenuating circumstances are, you have to admit with me, that is hard to overcome that visual right in front of me, right in my face evidence. But yet there were all these other extenuating circumstances. The big question that this was all about, not whether a police officer used excessive force and killed somebody. No, I don't think anybody thinks he meant to kill him. He certainly can be argued, and the jurors believe that he did kill him, or did play a heavy hand, a murderous hand in his death. But the big question that this was all about is this an example of systematic police racism? I haven't heard anybody address that question since the verdict. I didn't hear anything about it during the trial. Yes, we had a police officer guilty of excessive force. But did it answer the question? Was this an example of systematic police racism? Do we need to continue to defund or reform police forces? You just heard Attorney General Merrick Garland announce today that he's going to be launching an investigation into the Minneapolis police force to see if there's some kind of systematic problem in the way they police down there. That question wasn't answered in the trial, so therefore the Black Lives Matter people are not happy because all they don't care whether a policeman used force or not. They're trying to promote systematic racism by police narrative. That's their narrative. And I don't know that this conviction helped them in any way. What do you think? I don't know. So I think that question, I mean, I'm not aware that there's any hate crime accelerator being considered when it comes to the sentencing. The judge just casually mentioned there'd be sentencing in about 8 weeks. There was no mention of hate crime. So if there's systematic police racism, then this would be a hate crime, right? I mean, by my way of thinking, right? I haven't heard hate crime or systematic racism mentioned in any part of this. So I don't know what the hell is going on with that. So let's see what plays out there. All right, one more point before we bring on our guest, but there was one important item which I indirectly alluded to earlier. Now also think of the Ohio shooting a few days ago, right? Where that in Ohio, the man was being arrested and broke free, tried to get in his car. The police officer woman thought she was shooting a taser, but she shot a gun, supposedly, but it was all on video. We saw the guy break away. Then there was another video the other day, a woman with a knife about to stab another woman, and the police shot her. And apparently she died. What I'm getting at is the importance of police body cameras. So we can see the truth. Just think of the contrast of George Floyd, the guy in the car, the girl with the knife. Just think of the contrast of those stories. We saw the video compared to Michael Brown in St. Louis. Did he have his hands up? Shoot, don't shoot, brother, or whatever he said? I don't know. Some people say yes. Every law enforcement agency and official investigation said no. But imagine if we had the body cam video. It would help for both sides. It would help prevent the crazy left lunatics from creating some false narrative, apparently like they did with the Michael Brown hands up story. And it would also be a hard piece of evidence against a police officer if they did overstep their bounds, just like we saw with Derek Chauvin. So I think, there's nothing like transparency and the truth. Even with that video, there was some room for argument, but without the video, imagine how that George Floyd trial might have gone, right? So we need body cams, we need transparency, we need the truth, and most importantly, we need to end these false narratives that are purposely created by radicals on the left. And so switching gears now, one of the false narratives is that the Green New Deal won't cost anybody anything. It's just saving the planet. All is nice. Let's bring on our guest, former state Senate candidate, Charles Chad Callanan. Chad, welcome back to In the Dugout. How are you?
Hey, I'm great, Mike. How are you? I got my hat,
Yeah, I see you're playing a little ball with us today. Is that an angler's hat there?
No, that's my favorite team, the United States Navy. So.
That's a Navy hat. I couldn't see, Claude. It looked like it might have had all those slots where you put. Don't anglers have?
No, I'm the world's unluckiest fisherman. You don't want to fish with me. It's just cold. That's about it.
U.S. Navy. All right. So, first of all, you've been on the show before. You were on shortly after the election, talking about some of the inconsistencies on our state with the mail ballots, but you're on today for a different reason. After the Act on Climate bill passed and was signed into law by Governor McKee, there was a big debate about whether businesses and homeowners would have to convert their homes to some new green form of electric heat. And you took it a step further. Tell us what you did.
Well, like any homeowner, I wanted to find out what it was going to cost me, and so the parameters that I used were basically the off-the-shelf technology that exists as it exists today, the average size home, and the two homes I didn't pick at random. So
before we go there, the debate was that at some point this EC to the fourth commission is going to mandate that every structure, right, be retrofitted to meet some green standard, right?
They want to be carbon neutral, and they were expecting 45% of households to convert within the next 9 years.
Right. Now, that specific language was not that clearly defined in the law, but clearly it would be in the purview of this unelected group of ideologues to mandate such a thing, because we know that's what they're trying to do in other parts of the country, right? So with that as a backdrop, if that were to happen, you did what?
I put together some cost estimates for what it would cost to convert what I found to be 2 average homes in Rhode Island. And I went to my contractors that I've worked with for more than a decade. I have guys
I'm sharing your post as it appeared on Facebook.
Okay, great. I'm looking at it right now.
Through it. Yep.
Yeah, so these are gentlemen that I'm very comfortable, have done some pretty large projects with, both residential and commercial. Also was in touch with a good friend of mine who's an engineer. And so we kind of talked the project through. So as you know, the 2 houses I picked were Bridget Valverde's and Justine Caldwell's.
One of whom was your Senate opponent as an incumbent, and the other one is the representative from East Greenwich.
Yeah, both of them voted for this Green New Deal. Okay. So I basically looked and said, okay, if we had to convert this tomorrow, and I believe you should lead from the front, if we were going to convert your houses tomorrow, this is what you would have to do to convert them. So in the case of Senator Valverde's home, pretty standard stuff here, built 1980, 2,800 square feet, 4 bedrooms, just a little under a half-acre lot.
So maybe just a little bit bigger than your average house, right? Maybe.
Yeah, somewhat.
In East Greenwich, it would be small. Where all you elites live, but no, just kidding.
Yeah. But and some of the things that you would consider doing here is okay. So both homes have oil heat. So those things, these are pretty substantial projects from a standpoint that you have to remove an oil furnace, you have to dispose of the oil that's in there, and you have to presumably remove all the piping. Some in cases you could leave it in place depending on how far you want it to go with this.
Those oil furnaces aren't small, are they?
No, depending on how old they are. I mean,
most people have them shoved way down in the basement somewhere, right?
Yeah. And some of the things you're thinking about when your oil furnace was installed, it was installed when your house was being framed. And the walls were not up.
Right.
So this is so now you have to go down there and cut this thing out of what is essentially the heart of your home. And in the case here, when these, house in both their cases, one's in 1980, one's 1973 vintage. So these are furnaces that are going to be over 20 years old, clearly. We don't know the condition of the tanks. I recently had to do this in a residential property that I own and replace the oil tank. If it goes well, it's still a huge job. But if you spill any oil in a residential property, you're getting a call from the EPA all day long, and they're coming, and it's going to get very, very expensive. So if this entire job went well, you've now replaced the furnace. You have to upgrade your electrical panel to 200 amp because you're going to put a heat pump in here. Heat pumps run electricity, and so there's you've got a lot of contractors going in and out of here. There's ducting that has to go along in here. So if you're going to have external ducting, a lot of homes are having in-house or in behind the walls. So now you got to rip your walls open too. Or, if you leave them external, I mean, it's going to be pretty ugly, depending on, how much you're willing to spend here. And it comes down to money. Now, the biggest expense out there, which I discovered, you can do all this, but for it to be truly green, you need the assistance of geothermal. And how that works is, and I'm not an engineer, but I took it from a standpoint of if I had to do this, I need to know what we're doing here. So you have two different types of geothermal heating. It works. The physics principle is that the ambient temperature of the ground is 55 degrees. So instead of in February heating your house from 0 to 70, you're taking it from 55.
All right. So hold on.
Yeah.
Hold on 1 second. You're losing
Yeah.
me, and you might be. All right. So are you saying that people aren't going to just be converting to electric heat off the grid, that they're going to be converting to some electric form of heat that's generated by geothermal?
No, there's no heat. There's no electricity generated by geothermal.
Then why do you need these wells?
Okay, for it to be cost effective, because otherwise your electric bill is going to get screamingly expensive. Because right now, you know that in Rhode Island, we already deal with
so what do the geothermal wells do then?
What it does is, okay, if you have to heat your house from your house today, say it was February 5th, and and the outside air temperature is 0, okay? The amount of energy to expend to heat the air from 0 to 70, which is a fairly or 65 or 60 if you're my dad, that comes with an energy expense, okay? What geothermal does is you are taking that air and running it through the ground, and you're heating it with the water that's in the ground to 55 degrees. It's a physics problem.
All right. So it's kind of like having the barnyard animals underneath your living quarters, because the heat will come up.
You're running that water through that the heat pump is running through this.
So it helps provide its own natural heat to the house,
or cooling. In the case of summer, it's cooling.
All right, got it.
Got it. Now that comes with two massive problems. One is you either have to dig down really deep if you don't have enough room, or if you don't hit an artesian well to get water, you have to drill multiple boreholes, which is where this gets really, really expensive, so that you can suck the water out of the ground so that there's enough of it in there to heat and cool. That's where the price really goes through the roof.
So between all these things, let me share the screen again here so everyone can see. So between geothermal, we don't have to get into too much detail. Geothermal well costs, electric panel conversion, heat pumps up and downstairs, insulation, removing, as you said, the existing heating. That can run anywhere from the mid 60s to the low 80s for your average size home in Rhode Island.
Correct. Now, anybody can just put in electrical baseboard heating like you saw in the 70s, but good luck paying that bill. I mean,
that bill will be thousands a month, right? Yeah.
It can't be done. It's inefficient. And as the current technology stands today, the use of heat pumps is not recommended anywhere above Maryland. And we clearly live above Maryland.
So here's the key thing I want to talk to you about too. I'm glad we got a few minutes left here. Is over here. So while it may or may not be required, because we know this is how they've done things in the past. Well, it may or may not require that as long as you're living in your home, you make this change. They may require it. They may not. But certainly I would expect they'll put in legislation. If you ever want to think about selling your home, it's going to have to be compliant with the green standards, which means you're going to have to do all this stuff to it. I mean, I can almost assure our listeners that will happen.
The best analogy for that is anybody who's ever dealt with a septic system that's bad or needs to be replaced. And that comes right off the price of your house if you're unwilling to do the work. So if the cost of putting a new septic system is $40,000, well, your house is worth $40,000 left to come into compliance. Now you're faced with houses that may have, a value of, say $300,000, but you have to do $81,000 worth of upgrades. That's an awful lot of equity to lose. And that's going to kill your property values. And a lot of people say, well, why would I move there to do this? It wouldn't make any sense.
So here's the actual picture of the house of one. We blocked out the address. We don't want to dox anybody, even though it was on your Facebook page. But that's not an abnormally huge house, right?
No, that's pretty standard fare. I mean, there's nothing unusual about this house. I mean, this is, vintage 1980. So it's 100 more, unless they've done some significant upgrades. It's pretty average.
So for the average family, again, maybe that house, East Greenwich is a little upper end. So maybe that house is a little, but anyway, even if it's a little bit lower than 60 to 81K, you're still talking 40, 50, $60,000 for the average family to convert their home if they want to sell it, or even if they want to, we don't know what's going to happen if they want to live in it. And the media and the left made a big deal out of the fact that when the Republicans brought up a number of $50,000 as a conversion cost during the floor debate, the supporters of the climate bill and the media, oh my God, there's no way near $50,000. Well, you just proved that it can easily get to that point. Right?
I tell my detractors, go out there and prove me wrong. I tell me I'm wrong, but go out there and search what the price of a heat pump is. How much a contractor is going to charge an hour. I mean, these things are very readily found and they're very easily identifiable. So I'm not wrong.
All right. What kind of feedback have you gotten or pushback from either the senator, the rep, or others since you put this post up about?
Most of them say I'm just picking on them. The detractors, they don't argue the numbers, or they say they don't know what you're talking about, and I'll say, okay, well then prove to me that I'm wrong, and you can't. The basic, there's some basic physics here. If you want to heat or cool a 2,000 square foot house, one floor, you generally have 2 floors, you need a 4-ton unit. Okay, what does a 4-ton unit cost? So, right. This isn't difficult.
All right, final question. We had hoped that, I think everybody could have predicted how Senator Valverde and Representative Caldwell would have voted on these bills. I think a lot of us were surprised that Governor McKee signed on. And we're now hearing through our sources that he's also going to sign on to the TCI, Transportation and Climate Initiative gas tax bill. As a past Senate candidate, maybe a future one, who knows, your thoughts on Governor McKee and whether his credibility as an advocate for small business owners, or small businesses, I should say, can survive giving these two highly anti-business positions he appears to be taking.
Well, me, I'm not one to mince words. I don't think he has any credibility, and I don't think there's too many people in the Hill and the General Assembly of the Senate who have any credibility. This state clearly is business unfriendly. It's painfully obvious. You'd have to be blind not to see it. And we have so much to offer, and yet we are our own worst enemy. Continue to allow some of this behavior.
Chad Callahan, thank you for joining us on In the Dugout today. And if you have any updates to this, if you get proven wrong or you get proven right and you get some feedback, come back. But hey, this was great work you did here. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for your hard work on this.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
All right. Chad Callahan, Charles Callanan, former Senate candidate. All right. Just by way of, before we bring in our featured guest today, let me just read the first paragraph from an article he wrote to introduce the topic. So, across the country, both state and federal levels, Republican legislators are signing on to seemingly bipartisan bills that mandate action civics. This is out of school protests and lobbying projects. We can presume nearly always for leftist causes, for course credit. Few Republicans have ever heard of the action civics term, so it's easy enough to deceive them, he says. When they see a proposal for project-based civics, they think something innocuous like an internship at the mayor's office or a debate club. But little do these Republicans know, according to our guest, that they're actually authorizing public school students to organize course-credited out-of-school demonstrations or lobbyist expeditions for such leftist causes, my term leftist, like gun control, the Green New Deal, or defunding the police. These are the sentiments of Stanley Kurtz, who joins us today on In the Dugout. Stanley, welcome to Rhode Island and welcome to In the Dugout with me.
Mike, thanks so much for having me.
So you are a journalist for National Review. You appear on multiple national news shows. You're also a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. But most importantly, you're a Pittsburgh Pirates fan. And I know you don't have a cap for us today, but tell us about, and you love Bill Mazeroski, one of your heroes.
Well, that's right, Mike. I'm not a hat person, but I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and I was just a kid during the 1960 World Series when Bill Mazeroski hit that famous game-winning home run in the bottom of the ninth of the seventh game. And it may not sound important, but it meant a lot to me that his middle name was Stanley. His middle name was Stanley.
Bill Stanley Mazeroski, huh?
And I am just seared with memories of that. I remember being in school, and back in those days, you had these little rectangular transistor radios, and the boys would hide them in the well of their desks. They used to have these open top desks and have a little earpiece going into their ear. Try to hide that from the teacher.
Yeah.
Gym teacher would come and announce some event from the game, and you could hear applause break out in one room, and then he'd go into the next room, and you could hear applause coming down the hall, and you were just waiting to hear what had happened. And I remember when he hit the home run, I had this pirate pennant, and I jumped so high that I hit a hole into the little ceiling, and I came back 30 or 40 years later to visit the house, which we didn't have anymore. And I went down into the basement, and the hole was still there.
If it was a cartoon, that you would have been hanging by your hand hanging from the ceiling from that. Now, my personal, as you know, I told you a little bit about this. When I played for the Montreal Expos, I was being converted from a left-right fielder into a first baseman, and one of the spring training coaches for the team was Bill Mazeroski for the Montreal Expos. So he and I spent endless hours together, and before workouts and during workouts, where one of the other coaches would just hit me 200 ground balls a day, and he would show me some training. I grew up a shortstop, but I had played outfield in the minor league, so he worked on a lot of infield things with me. So I spent a lot of time. And what a wonderfully nice man and gentleman he is. I don't know if you ever got to meet him or know him, but I can tell you that he is just a wonderful gentleman.
Well,
Yep.
That is a cruel and painful thing that you're telling me, and I am profoundly envious.
And I can also tell you that my very first appearance in the big leagues was against the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1982.
Oh my goodness!
In the last game of my first game was Willie Stargell's last game. That was that.
Wow!
I remember. He batted leadoff. They batted him leadoff, let him bat twice, and then they took him out. And I got to pinch hit later in the game against Don Robinson. So anyway,
I used to go to Forbes Field. Well, but we'll get too far afield here.
Yep. All right. So what's going on? You're saying that Rhode Island. Now, let me say this: in the House and the Senate, Representative Newberry, Senator De La Cruz are great conservatives, great friends, people we should all be proud of. But you pretty much say they might be duped here by what's going on with this bill they're sponsoring. Please explain.
Well, that's it, Mike. Conservatives literally are being duped because almost no one, period, but certainly not conservatives, have heard of this Action Civics. Right now, it's been mandated in 2 states, Illinois and Massachusetts. So it's very new. It's not widely known. And the left has figured out a way to talk about this that will not bother people. So again, project-based civics is another word for action civics, and the bill uses that language. Now, if someone comes to you and says, we'd like to do a civics bill, if you're a conservative, you get a warm, fuzzy feeling, and you think, yes, we'll teach them about the 3 branches and the principles of federalism. That's exactly what we need to do to fight against the 1619 Project and critical race theory. And they hand you a bill, and it says you'll have to do a project, and you nod your head and you sign off. But the reality is, if you look closely at the bill, the project effectively mandates that students go out and lobby their local school boards or even the state legislature itself on behalf of legislation. And given the biases of teachers, as we know from the teachers' unions, given the biases of students, and given the biases of the nonprofit organizations that organize all of this activity, it's almost inevitable that most of the protests will be on the left, and a lot of students who don't really want to go along or don't have strong opinions
You won't
will
have a
get,
choice. Yeah.
they won't have a choice because they don't want to be left out. And so they'll go with the flow. And that's just wrong. That's why you're supposed to keep politics out of the classroom. But this one literally puts politics
Right. Now,
into the classroom.
you can teach civics and the principles of American government without bringing in controversial current events, can't you?
Absolutely. And in my day, we had high school debate back in Pittsburgh. I was in high school debate. And when you were in debate, you had to learn the affirmative and the negative.
Right.
The point was not to make an activist out of you, but to teach you that every side has strengths and weaknesses and to learn how to think through both sides of the issue.
All right, let's circle back, unpack this a little, some of the things you said there. But first, let me ask you this. You've looked at the Rhode Island bill, right? You've read it.
Oh, yes.
Is the language what you would call model legislation, language that you have specifically seen in other states like Illinois, Massachusetts, and maybe other states that are considering this, or is just are just the concepts the same?
The particular wording is slightly different, but essentially this is patterned, I would say, basically on the Illinois bill. Again,
when was that adopted?
2015. Then Massachusetts was 2018. For example, I'll give you an example.
Sure.
And this happened in Massachusetts as well as Illinois. The Illinois bill cleverly included a provision to allow the acceptance of private funding to the state education program for civics. And as a result of that, a super left-leaning foundation called the McCormick Foundation in Chicago, which backs critical race theory and everything that's on the left, has effectively taken over civics education in the state. They've offered all this money. No one in the state wants to say, well, no, you can't do that. The Chicago people agree with it politically anyway, but the people in downstate, Illinois, are sort of put upon by this leftist civics that's pushed by this liberal foundation. Well, the Rhode Island bill has the same provision, the provision to allow private funding.
It's called a Civics Project Trust Fund, where private organizations can donate into it. Now, you and I know how that works. If you're the big donor into that fund, you're going to pretty much get your way, aren't you?
Exactly. You'll be kind and generous and set up a nice little website and professional development training programs, and they'll all just happen to be leftist.
Well, all right. So let me challenge that point. Why couldn't a center-right organization, a conservative organization, have that same kind of influence if they have put that kind of money up?
Well, right now the big money is on the left, as I think your people know from the direction that businesses are taking. But frankly, even if it was coming from the right, that would also be wrong. What's really happening here is that states are surrendering their birthright. Education is supposed to be controlled by the people through their representatives, not by foundations. And so in order to...
Especially politically oriented foundations, right? Or agenda-driven foundations, right?
Yes.
On either side, right? On either side.
On either side. So why would you give up your democratic control by the people of the education system, basically for some offering money, and then you cede control to them? That's wrong in whichever direction it goes. So A, we've got a problem of principle here. It is undemocratic and unrepresentative. And B, in pragmatic terms, 9 times out of 10, certainly in a blue state like Rhode Island, it's going to end up being taken over by the left. So we have a practical and a principled problem.
Right. So in theory, you could say, hey, it would be open to both sides, but A, it shouldn't be open to either side to influence education. And B, in reality, we know the left are going to have the larger influence here. If it didn't have the Civics Project Trust Fund, let's pretend for a minute, all right, like the left likes to do. Let's pretend. If we didn't have the Civics Project Trust Fund, how would you feel about this legislation?
It would still be awful, Mike. And here's some more reasons. Well, first of all, as I've already mentioned, the lobbying and the protests, but there's more to it. There are innocent sounding provisions in this bill that just say, well, we want to attract more diverse teachers. Okay, That sounds good. I mean, it sounds reasonable. We should have teachers from every race and ethnic group. Nothing wrong with that. But again, if you go to Illinois, you'll see that they've just issued a series of teaching standards forcing teachers to affirm the concept of structural racism, affirm the multiplicity and fluidity of gender, to teach politically progressive concepts. And the whole thing is justified publicly by saying this will help us to attract a more diverse teaching force.
Nothing
But
about excellence or qualifications or performance?
the opposite, what the new Illinois standards actually say, believe it or not, they encourage teachers to consider substituting for tests, grading their students according to whether they participate in these political action projects. So basically, you can get an A if you have a good political protest.
All right. So I talked to one of the bill sponsors today, and just so you know, he's going to be on our show tomorrow. He'll watch what you said, and we'll hear his side of it. But one of it, I only talked to him for a couple minutes today, and one of his comments was, "Listen, this critical race theory stuff or this diversity stuff is going to be taught in our schools, regardless of whether this bill passes or not. What needs to happen is parents need to get involved with local school boards and local and rather, so he's basically saying, I don't see how this bill enhances something that is already happening and going to happen unless parents stop it. Your thoughts on that?"
Well, if that was true, then I think you should pack up and just quit and leave the state. Or what would be the point of being conservative at that point? I mean, in Illinois, what's happened is,
Yeah,
sure,
give us some real life examples. Yeah.
in Illinois, this stuff has gone on in Chicago, but the problem is when the state passed a bill, then all of a sudden, this foundation stepped in and started sending out all these leftist teachers to do professional development for the teachers downstate in conservative districts. And it was able to say, hey, this is in the law. This is a state law. So you have to get with the program here. So if there are, and I don't know, I know Rhode Island obviously is not a massively large state, but if you have any conservative school districts or even conservative teachers, their independence will be completely undercut by this bill. Anyone who would have resisted the trend of critical race theory will now have a giant lever of state law exercised against them. Why would you want to feed into that?
All right, so fair point. It may be happening, but if it's happening without any quote authorization, if you would, right? You're saying this would authorize some kind of political activist civics. And like we discussed earlier, you predict that will go. All right, well, I want to also ask you, do you have just a couple more minutes, Stanley?
Yes.
Okay, we're talking with Stanley Kurtz, National Review. In fact, before we even go any further, tell me what the it says you're a senior fellow at Ethics and Public Policy Center. What is that part of National Review, or is that something else?
No, that's a think tank, a conservative leaning think tank in Washington, D.C. But I also write regularly for National Review online.
Okay.
So I do both of those things.
Okay, just not familiar with the work at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I got to look it up now. I'm sure it's quite interesting. One of your more recent posts talks about this generically and talks about how maybe, or would you say definitely, the Biden administration is pushing this kind of stuff, that the Biden administration, and I think you made a really brilliant point. It's happening in this state, in my circles, privately, a little bit publicly. A lot of conservatives say, God, we got to teach our kids civics. Well, the left is masters at co-opting ideas. So they're saying, okay, well, if we're going to teach civics, we're going to teach it our way, and we're going to teach it with these action-oriented lobbying or protest components to it that will pretty much guarantee that we can get extra voices for our left-wing agenda. And you're saying that there are efforts by the Biden administration to promote this kind of action civics. What can you tell us about that?
There are a couple things to say, Mike. First of all, the Biden administration put out a rule earlier this week that essentially said openly and clearly that it is going to give priority to education grants that support things like the 1619 Project and critical race theory.
Wait a minute, it will
And
directly say that, or that will
it
be
said
the
that.
unspoken word?
No, it said it straight out. So just earlier, right on this show, I said there are these innocent sounding phrases, but when it actually gets put in practice, you'll get these extreme leftist critical race theory things. Well, I said that about the federal bill as well. And of course, the left said, oh, there goes Stanley Kurtz with his crazy imaginings. And now the Biden administration has just put out a rule that formally says, in order to get more diverse teachers, a more diverse teacher force, and to help underrepresented students, we want to push the 1619 Project in critical race theory. So they literally validated my point. So the first point to make is what happened just now with Biden shows that what I'm saying about what will happen with the Rhode Island bill is not crazy. But the second point is that if this giant federal bill called the Civic Secures Democracy Act passes, which authorizes $1 billion.
This is an actual bill in the U.S. Congress?
Oh, yes. And by the way,
Civic Secures Democracy Act. Okay.
Yes. And it has co-sponsorship by Senator John Cornyn in the Senate and Tom Cole, the Republican, in the House.
So again, Republicans being duped?
Exactly. And that bill, which I predicted would have all these problems, the Biden rule shows that it will. Well, if that bill were to pass, then Rhode Island will be able to compete for grants, massive grants. We're talking about $1 billion a year for 6 years. And so the states will compete for grants. This is just like the way the Common Core.
Yeah, Common Core, it sounds like, yeah.
And it was raised to the top grants from the Obama administration that spread that to all the states. So they're going to try to spread grants that have the same preference for action civics and critical race theory to all the states.
You know what else it sounds like, just to digress a second, and I think you were on this many, many years ago. Correct me if I'm wrong. But this sounds like a HUD community development block grant. If you do our radical left agenda, you'll get more money. And of course, no locality, no school district can ever say no to more free money, right?
Bingo,
right?
bingo.
Okay.
And if you look up my name and Biden and zoning, you'll see my latest writings on that issue. And yes, it is exactly parallel. We have a federalist system in this country, or at least that's what we're supposed to have, where government is layered. There's the federal level, and whatever is not delegated by the Constitution to the federal government goes to the states, and states traditionally allow considerable leeway on education, on housing issues to localities. Wow. And the Democrats in Biden are determined to turn all that on its head.
So the Department of Education is going to become what, to advancing leftist propaganda, what HUD was to advancing leftist housing policies.
And the Common Core in math and English was the precursor, but this is the really big deal because it's all about the most politically charged subject areas.
And I don't even know, who is is there an education commissioner?
Yes. And I'm embarrassed to say that I can't remember his name. He's just been appointed.
Is he a wacko?
I don't know that he has a strong record, but I'll tell you something. Whoever are the bureaucrats in the Biden administration education department are clueless, in my view, because they made the mistake, as they famously say, a gaffe in Washington is when you tell the truth. And when they put out this rule saying they were going to push the 1619 Project and critical race theory, that was a classic Washington gaffe.
Yeah, I can't believe they actually put that in writing. Oh my God, somewhere.
They put it in writing, and all heck is breaking loose ever since I put that piece out, because people went to the rule and their eyes are popping out.
Good for you. Well, we know your comments about Biden are correct because he repeated it yesterday after the Chauvin trial. I mean, him and Vice President Harris talked about, it was stunning. It was so depressingly stunning. Can it be both at the same time?
Yes.
To see the president and vice president talking about systematic racism in our great country, when this country, yes, we've had our blemishes, but we have done more for civil rights. And we can't control the minds of every person out there, but my goodness, I mean, it was just so depressingly stunning. That's my term. I'm going to coin that phrase.
I couldn't agree more. And he's got an executive order which essentially says we're going to take these ideas of systemic racism and critical race theory, and we're going to make them part of an administration-wide initiative. And that's what the people at HUD cite when they talk about the zoning grants, and that's what the education department in the new rule cites. And so Biden has essentially promised that this isn't a slip that he made in one or two speeches. This is something he repeats all the time, has put in an executive order, and his departments are methodically and systematically trying to enact it in all the tentacles and details of federal policy. So this is a
And they'll
massive thing.
throw that money at the school districts, which they won't be able to resist, just like with HUD, right?
And he was
Affirmatively
supposed to be
furthering
moderate.
fair housing, right? What are they going to call this one? A furthering critical race theory, right?
That's pretty good.
Say, maybe you can cite me in one of your articles for coming. All right, two more quick ones, Stanley. You've been so generous with your time, but this is, I mean, listen, there are parents groups all over the state call me. What can I do? We're hearing that critical race theory or 1619 is coming. What can we do? And I'm going to get to that in a second, but I'm going to quote again from, and I want you to direct this again. Remember, he and while she won't be on our show tomorrow, the Republican sponsors of this bill are good friends of ours. They're good conservatives. But here's what you generally said in one of your other articles, and I'm quoting here. Republicans and conservative education establishment figures who have foolishly bought into bogus bipartisan efforts to revive the teaching of American history and civics need to repudiate their misbegotten alliances. So having said that, what would be your message, again, to our friends who sponsored these bills, one of whom will be on tomorrow? What is your message to him?
My message is the same as it would be to Senators Cornyn and Tom Cole, and that is as an appeal to do this, and they have an easy out and a legitimate reason. I can easily understand why any of them might have signed on to this bill, because as I said, nobody's ever heard of action civics. Nobody understands what's really going on. But now that that Biden rule has come out, now that all of these things have been clarified,
Kind
it
of
is
validates it, huh?
right. It's perfectly legitimate to say, okay, I was on board for traditional civics and genuine bipartisanship. But now that I learn what action civics is, and now that I see what the Biden administration is doing, which I know is going to be echoed in this state, I'm out of here.
There was a competing, well, there was another bill. We had the sponsor of that bill on earlier, maybe a month ago, who put in a bill, and without mentioning critical race theory by name or 1619, basically said that it would ban all K through 12 public schools from teaching anything that had any general categorizations about any racial group of people, right? So that was a way to, because if they change the name of it, it would still apply. Would you encourage passage of that kind of bill? It's probably not going to go anywhere. It's put in by a Republican alone sponsor. So we got two issues. The House, just to update, the House unanimously passed the bill you're talking about. That was Bill H5028. That unanimously passed, I think, last 71-0. Anytime Democrats 100% vote for something, I'm suspicious. Okay. The Senate bill hasn't been heard yet in committee. So there's still going to be a committee hearing. So we'll appeal to, whether we can have the senator pull the bill. I don't know. I don't know if we knew. We're going to hear the other side first before we even make any judgments. I got to hear from the reps. But anyway, this other bill that would ban this kind of racial stereotyping in any way, how do you feel? Do we need to go that far or just not pass these bills in your view?
I was ambivalent before, but now I favor such bills as a general matter, although some of them are poorly written. So much depends on the writing. But even in the best circumstances, there will be negative consequences. When you say that something can't or shouldn't be taught, you almost create martyrs. You bring more attention to something. But the truth is, first of all, at the K-12 level, it is not a violation of free speech. It is not like doing this with higher education. K-12 teachers do not have academic freedom. States and school districts have every right to determine what curriculum should be taught.
Interesting.
And so it is legitimate from that perspective. And whereas before I was worried, as I still am, about the potential negative effects of being that directive from the state level rather than allowing for local control, now that I see that the federal government is trying to move in and force something on the whole state and on every part of the country, I feel as a defensive measure, states have little choice but to pass such bills that would prevent this, but they have to be carefully crafted. And some people have come to me for advice, and there's a bill in Texas that I think is written in a good way, and it's going to have some tweaks probably. And that's, I think, a good model. I'd be happy to work with people on that. I haven't seen the Rhode Island bill. I'm in favor of it in principle. There are downsides, but given what's happening with the Biden administration, there's no other choice.
All right, the last area I'd like you to comment on, I don't know if you've seen anything as an example. I like to talk about parents. What can parents do? Parents are concerned. So let me put out two sort of general areas for you to comment on, and then we'll close it. And again, I'm so grateful, Stanley Kurtz, for your time. So obviously, parents need to organize. The left is organized on this, right? They are organized. This is part, you're claiming this is part of a national agenda. By the way, are there other states where bills like this are pending? You said it's passed.
Oh, yes.
Massachusetts and Illinois, but this is happening in other states as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
Parents need to organize because they do have influence at the local level, right? And so A, how do you feel about organizing? And B, even if they're not organized, don't parents have the right to view and understand a summary of the curricula that is being taught to their kids? And should they or do they have the capacity to opt their kids out of such programs? So again, I'll wrap it all up. What parents are listening today? I've directed some groups to listen. What is your message to them?
First, there is something that's been introduced in Texas. There's a model for it put out by the Goldwater Institute, a Transparency Act that would make curriculum transparent. The state ought to pass that. There's no doubt about it. Parents should definitely organize, not just organize in a group. They should organize in order to take over their local school boards if you're in a district where that's
run for office, right?
Yes. And in addition to that, there's a group called American Achievement Testing. American Achievement Testing, it's a nonprofit. I advise them. I don't get any money from them. They're not ready yet, but they're working on a wonderful curriculum based on a tremendous textbook that's already been published by Wilfred McClay. It's called Land of Hope. It's a great textbook on U.S. history by a top-rank historian that isn't like all of the left-biased textbooks that we see. If you can organize, take over your school board and get them to use Land of Hope as in your schools, that would be a wonderful thing. But the main thing is take over your school board. Of course, try to influence all this federal and local legislation. But even in a blue state, in certain areas, you can do something about your school board, and that is option number one in the blue states.
And the teaching of civics, again, just the final yes or no, the teaching of civics, which is 0 right now in Rhode Island, that plus, in your view, does it or does it not outweigh these potential action civics risks?
This bill is a disaster and should be defeated, although it sounds like that's not going to happen. If you were, good civics is good. Good civics ought to be taught. Unfortunately, what's happening here is a judo move where the left uses the conservative desire, the legitimate conservative desire to teach good civics to completely politicize the schools. And conservatives are about to get the opposite of what they want.
All right, Stanley Kurtz, National Review. Wow, senior fellow at Ethics and Public Policy Center. Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch if there's something more. If you have any follow-ups of this, if you learn anything more, please reach out to us. I'll be checking your blogs more regularly now, since this topic is, I mean, God, now that I've made this unbelievably scary analogy to to the HUD sustainable development. We had to think it was called Roadmap Rhode Island in our state was the whole effort. Now that, and a lot of our viewers like a Roadmap Rhode Island, holy crumb. So this is the Roadmap Rhode Island of education. This is, oh my God, this puts a whole new theory on this. But again,
That's it.
we're going to hear from the other side tomorrow, to be fair. We're going to hear from the sponsors. We won't make a judgment till after that. But Stanley, thank you. We hope to have you on the show again soon. Stanley Kurtz, National Review.
Thanks, Mike. Loved it.
Hey, Stanley, take care. Wow, folks. Wow. Okay. Again, I know I sound like I'm prejudging, and hey, when you only hear one side of the story, it influences you. But boy, that sets up a very, very scary image in my mind, the Roadmap Rhode Island of education. With this Biden rule, federal, this is now not just a local bill. This is not, a state bill that deals with, and it's not just local choice. There's going to be federal public relations, content, I would assume, and certainly, as Stanley Kurtz said, monetary support to make sure that Action Civics has the left-leaning and therefore false narrative to it. And unless we control the school districts, there is no school district or locality that's going to say no to what they perceive as free federal money, just like they could never say no to the community development block grants from HUD when it came to developing these really crazy affordable housing ideas. Okay, whole new spin on this now. Weighs heavily. We're going to hear the other side tomorrow. Tune in tomorrow, the first half hour. Brian Newberry will talk about the bill. Brian Newberry's a good guy. Don't get me wrong. Was he duped? Does he know what he's getting into? Does he understand the national? As Stanley Kurtz, does he even believe it? I don't know. We'll see. And then we'll form a judgment. But we're going to hear from Brian Newberry. And then in the second half of the show tomorrow, again, Dr. Andrew Boston, who is wondering why there's not more news or concern about this 50-year-old woman who dropped dead hours after taking vaccine here in Rhode Island. Have we concluded whether the two are tied together or not? Why isn't the media raising any questions? Well, I think we know those answers, right? That when you're woke and you have your blinders on, you only see or hear the things that your politically correct masters tell you that you can see or hear, and you ignore everything else. We know that. So we'll see if Dr. Boston comes up with any more supporting information on this issue in Rhode Island. So again, terrific show today. I want to thank Charles Callanan for being on, exposing the $50,000 plus, maybe significantly plus cost that every building, every homeowner, business owner, or at least structure owner, property owner, let's put it that way, commercial or residential in Rhode Island, may have to undergo in coming decades. It's not going to be this year. It's not going to be next year, but it could be coming very soon to a ordinance or statewide regulation near you. So for In the Dugout, Mike Stenos, what a show today. One of our best ever. And we'll have more action for you tomorrow at 4 p.m. on rifreedom.org/live. Don't forget to subscribe.